the record button. The floor is all yours.
Great, thank you, Peter. And yeah, the title basically says it all. So that gives you the main take-home message. Thank you very much to Peter and the organizers. This is a really cool seminar series I'm happy to be a part of, and I hope I'll be able to attend more of your lectures in the future. This project is very much a work in progress, so feel free to, all of your critiques and comments are welcome. And this is a collaboration also with Shana Lou Levy and Jorge Pena, but also given this is a work in progress, my colleagues are deserving of an equal amount of credit, but none of the critiques. So yeah, that's all to be directed towards me, and I'll kind of explain where we are in this project. And so I want to introduce this idea that leaders play an important role in teaching symbolic culture, and that this is important also for sustaining cooperation, and particularly in more egalitarian societies. There's some of you that I don't know, and some of you may not know me, so I want to just quickly introduce myself. I have a background in anthropology and psychology from the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. I did my PhD at WSU in evolutionary anthropology. And as Peter mentioned, I was just recently a postdoc at IST for 4 years and just joined UM6P, that's the French acronym, Mohammed VI Polytechnic University. And I'm based in this faculty of governance, economics, and social sciences. And then as a researcher affiliated with the African Institute for Research in Economics and Social Sciences. This is a really, really cool and interesting campus focused on interdisciplinarity and research for Africa and the Global South. And so it's been a really cool transition from IST to UM6P. And my work broadly focuses on understanding variation in human socioecology. And I sort of have two methodological tracks or cogs, if you will, to take this on. I do cross-cultural research, which I'm going to be talking about today, where I build novel quantitative databases using the ethnographic record. And then I also do ethnographic fieldwork in Southwest Ethiopia, most recently, primarily with rural pastoralists, but I've also worked with former hunter-gatherers in the forest. And so these methods for me are very mutually reinforcing. So I'm often using results or insights that I gain from one approach to design hypotheses or other methods I use in the other. And for my fieldwork, I also co-direct the Omo Valley Research Project. So this is a large-scale, longitudinal, and comparative project where my co-director, Luke Glowacki, and I are working with multiple different rural subsistence-based populations. And so we focus on social and biological and health science as these populations transition increasingly to market economies. And then we also focus on development and supporting education and different aspects of philanthropy across Southwest Ethiopia. And most of my research, most of my work focuses on leadership and followership and social hierarchy. And for me, these sort of social processes are central to a lot of what we're interested in as evolutionary social scientists. So from a sort of focus on leadership and followership, I also research conflict and mediation, norm violations and punishments, transitions in market integration and other sociocultural features, and then social learning and teaching. And what I'll be talking about today is concerning this dimension of the relationship between social learning and teaching and its links to leadership. And so I want to kind of preface just by emphasizing that the evolution of cooperation is not a puzzle. Maybe it was at some point in the past, long ago. If anybody tells you this, they obviously have some reading to do. Obviously, this is a huge field, and there are many possible mechanisms by which autonomous agents can engage and stabilize in cooperative relationships. And so this project is sort of rooted in the idea that norms and institutions promote cooperation. And we're focusing specifically on egalitarian societies. Now I'm going to kind of put aside unpacking that entirely. Anthropologists, there's lots of ways we conceptualize and think about egalitarian societies, and there's a lot of variation within any group of communities we might label as egalitarian, and particularly in terms of gender egalitarianism, age egalitarianism, economic or social egalitarianism, and so forth. But in egalitarian societies, these are typically communities that are relatively decentralized politically. There's relative equality in terms of economic resources. There's limited specialization in terms of economic roles. And there are strong social norms that promote sharing, cooperation. Children, in particular, for this project, Children typically play an important role in their own learning processes. And so all these are sort of a suite of characteristics that describe these types of societies where norms and institutions are super important for cooperation. Now, by norms here, there's obviously many approaches to defining norms. We're drawing on definitions that define norms as these suites of beliefs maintained by a group about how to behave in a particular context. So that's the sort of working definition of norms here. And so these norms promote different sorts of cultural institutions, and these institutions have to be learned. So social learning, acquiring this information from other individuals, is a necessary process for these institutions maintaining. It also contributes to their evolution over time. But for this information to be transmitted, obviously, informed individuals have to impart that knowledge to naive individuals. There's a variety of mechanisms by which it can be acquired, but one involves this sort of direct transmission, which I'll unpack that. Now, in this project, we're really focusing on opaque or symbolic culture, and I put a question mark here because I'm not convinced on the best sort of label for this sort of the definition. So if anyone has input here, I'm happy to hear that. In the sort of cumulative cultural evolution literature, opaque often refers to a process being causally opaque. Symbolic culture often refers to things like religious institutions and so forth. So what we're thinking about here is kind of draws on both of those things, although it's distinct from the causally opaque literature. So the fact that that term is really linked to those ideas is it's a bit confusing for us here. We're thinking about these different types of social information that you can't observe. So it's not like making a basket or learning how to tie your shoe. It's this stuff that's in people's head that is expressed in behavior that supports institutions like kinship structures, ideologies, how to behave in a particular context. And so that's what I'm going to be referring to. And this, I'll use symbolic culture from here on out, but if I use opaque, it's referring to the same concept. I haven't updated all the plots, so anyways. This symbolic culture, I want to contend, really requires teaching because it's not so easily observable, because it is sort of opaque to the naive individuals. It's not something you can just watch people doing quite so easily. You can't see all the nuances or the components of it that are in individuals' heads. And even if you can see certain aspects of the behavior manifest, there's a lot of the sort of firmware or the packaging of this behavior that isn't behaviorally expressed. And so I'm going to define this symbolic or opaque culture as the socially transmitted information concerning these collectively held beliefs or values or ideas which can't be directly observed. Things like cosmology, as opposed to how to make a particular tool, for example. And so this type of cultural information requires teaching. And most of this literature, this sort of evolutionary anthropological literature or developmental psychology, is often defining teaching as when an individual modifies their behavior. So there's some cost, if nothing else, an opportunity cost. They're modifying their behavior to specifically impart information to a naive individual, whether it be information or skills and so forth. So this is the sort of working definition of teaching we draw on. And then so that raises the question, who can teach this symbolic culture? Okay, well, most of my work is on leadership, and evolutionary anthropologists, evolutionary social scientists are typically defining leaders as individuals within a group who have some disproportionate influence over group outcomes or goals or decisions. And so to really define a leader, you have to first define your group, and then you can define or measure who has most influence over what particular group goals or decisions, and that can define a leader. And so taking all these definitions I've just thrown at you in mind, what this basically leads us to is this idea that teachers are a type of leader, and leaders will often be teachers. And I'm going to unpack this more. Now, you might be thinking about prestige-biased social learning. This is an important and widespread topic in a lot of this literature. But what we're thinking about is sort of the flip side of this coin, which I'm going to introduce as leader-biased teaching. So a lot of the prestige-biased social learning research draws its origin in work by Joe Henrich and his colleagues. There's a lot of really important and influential work in this domain. One paper of Henrich with Schudick and Boyd introduces the big man mechanism. And this is a co-evolutionary argument, a co-evolutionary mechanism which promotes cooperation. And so just to kind of summarize a few key points from their argument, in their model, they're correlated behavioral phenotypes. So cooperative individuals are attracting cooperative individuals, where individuals are learning cooperative behaviors from influential cooperative individuals. And so these status differences, individuals use prestige as a cue for who to follow. So lower status, less prestigious individuals are then inclined to copy these particularly prestigious individuals. So prestige is the cue of who to copy, and you copy those individuals to learn from them. And then these prestigious individuals can induce cooperation if they are cooperative by being copied by the non-prestigious individuals, and therefore then this spreads cooperative behavior and ultimately cooperative genes. So that's kind of their argument in a nutshell, to be really, really coarse-grained here. There's a lot more to it than that, but that's the big idea. What we're thinking is a bit different. So we're really thinking about not cooperative, not positive assortment, but rather inter-individual heterogeneity in neural capital. So neural capital, this term is coming from the embodied capital theory. Neural capital is basically the embodied capital of cognition in the brain. So it's this sort of catch-all term that characterizes knowledge and intelligence. It includes things like cognition or intelligence, but also learned information, expertise, maybe even personality, etc. And so this variation creates a market for teachers. There's variation in capacities and knowledge distribution. There's knowledge asymmetries. And so what we're thinking about then is that high status individuals who are also influential, these are then leaders by definition, they would be motivated to spread these particularly pro-social cultural variants. So if other individuals in the group are cooperative and adhering to these pro-social norms, that's going to improve their own outcomes. It's a selfish strategy. It's good for them. It's also good for their close interdependent others. So it's going to be their motivation to spread these cooperative norms. And so then teaching these cooperative norms by informed and influential individuals who have the capacity to do it. They need the platform to do it and the capacity to do it. This is a selfish strategy, and it's jointly beneficial to them, their interdependent others, but also just to their other group members who are going to profit from being in a group of cooperative individuals. And so it's pretty obvious once you think about it that there's many reasons why an influential individual may not want a subordinate or a naive or an influenceable individual to copy what they do. There could be very complex reasons why they might be doing a particular behavior in a particular context. So this kind of relates to the idea of do as I say, not as I do. If you're a boss, a parent, a PI, etc., you might be executing behaviors because you have some special knowledge, because you have some understanding of the context, that you don't necessarily want your subordinates to copy directly. If that's the case, if you have this symbolic, opaque cultural knowledge that's important for group functioning, then it's up to you to exactly teach what they need to do. You don't want them to just copy you because you're prestigious. That's sort of our flip side of this coin. So, I don't think that prestige bias social learning is not important or doesn't occur or anything like this. I think that prestige bias learning and leader bias teaching are sort of two sides of the same coin. And all we're doing here is wanting to emphasize these processes that we think are going on with leader bias teaching. And so this project also, yes.
Matthias has raised his hand to ask a question.
Yeah, does it matter that any parental advice that you get is it doesn't matter what you say, your kids are going to imitate what you do anyway?
So yeah, I think it matters, yes. I think that's an empirical question, right? If you are exhibiting behavior and you're also imparting knowledge directly, then the question is, does that impact behavior differently than either of those transmission mechanisms on their own? So I think it would depend. It depends a lot on the individual, the context, and the information. So it's a good point, but I think that basically to kind of sidestep it, I guess, is it really depends. But the teaching is the sort of intentional, directed information.
Well, the suggested empirical observation, I don't know if they're right, but is that the scope for teaching behaviors by telling people what to do is much more limited than the scope for making them do by showing.
Exactly. And so I think what I'm going to show and try and make the case is that these two types of cultural transmission are distinct, and that observation is going to be more common and associated with particular types of learning, and teaching is going to be required for other types of learning. And so really teaching is going to be important when you can't observe. That's the kind of the key idea we're having here. So if it's stuff, information that is important, but it can't be observed, it has to be taught. And so I've done some research looking systematically in the ethnographic record for evidence of prestige by social learning. And I just kind of want to quickly summarize some of this. I looked at the ethnographic record among hunter-gatherers, the same data I'm going to be talking about here a bit later. And we found limited ethnographic evidence of this prestige bias process when looking at different types of oblique social learning. Oblique is when you learn from older individuals who are not necessarily your parents. So we found limited evidence of oblique prestige bias social learning. In another sample, looking at the qualities of leaders, also testing this prestige biased leadership idea, we found limited evidence that prestigious leaders were emulated. So we found lots of evidence that leaders are respected, they're providing counsel, they have expertise, and so forth. These are the variables that come from the prestige model of learning. And these green points are showing the level of support at the text record level, and the red points are showing the level of support at the culture level. There's 59 cultures in this data and about 1,200 text records. But basically what you can see is there was relatively little evidence that leaders are preferentially emulated. So we didn't find strong systematic support for prestige biased learning in these two ethnographic samples. But what are leaders often doing? So we followed up with these data. We extended this data set in an exploratory fashion, really mining the ethnographic record for what it tells us that leaders are doing. And what we found, looking at the qualities of leaders, and this is work with my colleagues Kristen Simon and Hagen, we found that in the ethnographic record, leaders are mostly described as being high status. Well, that's not too surprising, but they're also described as being experienced and accomplished and knowledgeable and intelligent. And so here we're looking at the red dot is at this text record level. There's like 1,200 text records, and the purple dot in bars are at the culture level. There's 59 cultures. So this shows us that leaders are often, intelligent and knowledgeable. They have this experience, they're accomplished, very much the prestige style of leadership. What are leaders actually doing? So we have these same data, but for the functions of leaders. And these functions were all driven by the ethnographic record. We basically, to kind of tell it quickly, we kind of added them as we went through the coding process and then recoded everything again. So we didn't come up with these all on our own. The ethnographic record really provided these different variables. One of the key functions of leaders, this third one here I've highlighted, is providing counsel and direction. Now, we didn't find teaching exactly when following this methodology, but providing counsel and direction is pretty close to teaching, and it's quite widespread. We found evidence of it in more than 70% of the cultures sampled here. I've also done some empirical work to test these ideas in a small scale, relatively egalitarian society among former hunter-gatherers in Ethiopia. And one of the things we did here was test a few different traits between individuals in these elected leadership positions compared to individuals who are not in these elected leadership positions. It's sort of like a neighborhood administration type system. And here we're comparing men and women. These are Cohen's d effect sizes, so larger, higher values indicate a bias in favor of leaders for this trait. And what we found is that leaders in these communities are knowledgeable and intelligent, they're prestigious and respected. And this variable in the middle called mentor salience, it was a measure of how likely that individual is to be a good model to learn from. So this tells us that individuals who are elected in these leadership positions are knowledgeable, intelligent, they're respected, and they're also described as being good teachers. And so what we see from these sort of empirical results so far is that leaders are repositories of critical cultural knowledge, and this knowledge must be socially transmitted. We know this. And so just kind of a quick summary of the social learning literature. I'm going to assume this is really old hat to all of you, but this is social learning is the acquisition of information influenced by observation and interacting with some other individual. There's different modes of it. So how is it occurring? If it's vertical, this is from parents to offspring. If it's oblique, this is from some other individual to a younger individual. Horizontal transmission is between individuals of the same age, grade, generation. There are different processes. And so I want to contrast some of these processes with teaching. So other non-teaching processes include observation and imitation. Collaborative learning, when sort of naive individuals learn new skills by just kind of doing them together, experimenting together. Local enhancement is when some feature of the local environment is used to acquire a new skill. Stimulus enhancement is when a sort of toy or model of some other artifact might be used to facilitate learning. It's like children's like toy spears or a toy house in these pictures here. And then teaching. And teaching takes many forms. It might be directed guidance. It might be more informal. It could be in the form of storytelling. But it's when I gave the definition earlier of teaching, when someone modifies their behavior specifically to impart information to a naive individual. So I want to compare these other forms of social learning to teaching. And just to highlight, for quite a while, there's been sort of two different camps thinking about the role of teaching in human evolution. So there's been one camp that historically has downplayed the importance of teaching. Dave Lancey, for example, in this book chapter has a section called The Absence of Teaching. Margaret Mead also has some discussions along these lines, where they basically are just emphasizing the importance of observation and imitation and suggesting that teaching doesn't really occur among hunter-gatherers. On the other side, there's another group of scholars more rooted in cognitive science and evolutionary biology that have suggested that natural pedagogy is a form of teaching, and that teaching occurs in these types of groups, but it's just not formal and necessarily so directed and top down. This debate has mostly been somewhat resolved because of basically broader operational definitions. But nonetheless, this is the sort of context in which we are conducting this work. And so when I was doing my master's thesis, one of my advisors, Barry Hewlett, suggested we go through the ethnographic record and try and see if we could find evidence for these different types of modes of social learning. And so this is published in this edited volume on social learning and hunter-gatherers. This is still an important issue. In 2021, there's a whole special issue of Human Nature, just looking at social learning and teaching in particular. And I just want to highlight two studies from this special issue. On the left is a paper by Shana Liu-Levy, my colleague on this paper. This is looking at data from both Bayaka and Hadza foragers. And they note in the abstract that the Bayaka were more likely to report learning via teaching, less likely to report learning via observation than the Hadza. And so they're seeing evidence for teaching in some groups, but less than others. Karen Kramer on the right is reporting that Pune children in Venezuela, they care for their siblings and important economic contributors, but they learn by doing rather than instruction. So there's still sort of different authors find different results dependent upon the socioecology and also the sort of focus of the research, vertical, horizontal, oblique, and so forth. So it's still kind of an open question, the degree to which teaching occurs and when and why and how it is important. And so in our study, in the 2016 chapter, we basically found pretty widespread evidence that teaching was occurring across these hunter-gatherer groups. And this, I think, is still like my most cited paper. It had like no statistics in it. It was just percentages and frequency tables. I just kind of did it on the side. But I always wanted to come back to these data and do something else with it. So what we're going to do now is look at this evidence for teaching in comparison to all these other non-teaching social learning processes. So we're expanding upon these results, the descriptive results from this chapter. And there's really two aims here. We want to first use text analytic techniques to identify any semantic content of these ethnographic paragraphs. And if there's differences in the descriptions of instrumental culture, which is more tangible, hands-on, manufacturer type culture, and symbolic culture. And then two, we want to compare evidence for teaching compared to these other social learning processes in reference to the domain of information that is being transmitted, the mode of social learning, and the age and gender of the learner. So we're asking, is teaching distinct from other processes of social learning? And then is teaching by leaders linked to symbolic culture? So hopefully our results can address these questions. And a couple other points just to emphasize. There's a lot of literature in these fields, but most of the evolutionary approaches to teaching have almost exclusively focused on instrumental culture, hunting, manufacture, and so forth, subsistence skills. So really the role of teaching and symbolic culture has kind of been overlooked in this literature, and especially connections between this social learning literature, this leadership literature, and cooperation has been overlooked as well. So the data we're working with here are coming from the 2016 chapter. It's a systematic cross-cultural sample developed from the human relations area files. So the HRIF, if you're unfamiliar, is just a digital database of ethnographic texts, basically ebooks. So it's the primary documents. There's more than 360 cultures described, more than 6,000 documents. And the key function of this database is that you can search all these documents at the paragraph level using these subject codes that are basically exhaustive of all the types of subjects that social scientists are typically interested in. There's more than, I don't know, 900 of these different codes. So you can use the codes, you can also use words, you search the database, and you'll get back a return of paragraphs. So that'll be a sort of, it's a systematic sample of the ethnographic record focused on a particular topic. And in these data, we use 3 subject codes. So there's 3 codes that discuss the transmission of culture. There's the transmission of cultural norms, transmission of skills, transmission of beliefs. And just to kind of show you how these codes work, they're nested. There's larger groups and then individual codes within them. So these 3 codes are all within the 860 socialization category. And so this search, and we're limiting it to hunter-gatherer populations, gives us 982 paragraphs that come from 153 documents. Then we've coded these paragraphs. We've gone through each one and coded information on social learning at the instance of social learning, because some of these paragraphs give more than one instance of social learning. And then we're coding for the cultural domain that is being described. I'll illustrate this, the gender of the learner, the age of the learner, and the mode and process of the social learning. And so here's the geographic distribution of our culture sample. Here, the size of the point is proportional to the number of instances we have. And then the pie chart is showing how much is there evidence for teaching versus these other social learning processes. So you can see we have pretty broad geographic distribution. Most populations are giving some mix of evidence for teaching and other forms of social learning. And kind of to illustrate the structure of these data a bit more. So there's these 23 cultures on the left. Within each culture, there's multiple documents. So for the Mbuti, for example, there's these multiple documents. We have 77 documents in total. Each document may provide multiple paragraphs. There's 142 paragraphs. And then any paragraph may include multiple instances of social learning. To kind of show you how the coding works, here's one description from Colin Turnbull's ethnography. And he's talking about the role of the elder was one as vital as all others of socialization. During the daytime, when youth and adults were off on the hunt, the elders mostly stayed behind, so looking after the children, by playing with them, acting out great sagas of hunting and gathering days of yore, or just by laying back under the trees and telling stories. Old women and men of the camp filled the youngsters with their own love of the forest, their trust in it, respect for forest values, and so forth. And so from this, we coded 2 instances of social learning, one for cultural values. These are one for subsistence. They're both via the oblique mode. One is teaching via storytelling, one's collaborative learning, and so forth. Now, we also have these codes that are associated with the paragraph. It's going to include at least one of our search terms, so it includes transmission of cultural norms, but there are these other codes as well. So these codes are telling us something about the content of these paragraphs, and we're going to use those codes as data as well. Now, I know what you're thinking. Isn't the ethnographic record just incredibly biased? And the short answer to that is yes. There's much of the ethnographic record has been produced by white European men, in the 19th and early 20th century. But I don't think it's particularly useful to think of it as being biased, because just it is what it is. There was no alternative, given history, that's what we have. But actually, you might be surprised that there's there's a large number of female ethnographers. And ethnographers come in all different types. So some were social scientists, some were primarily archaeologists that then got involved in doing ethnography. Some were missionaries or explorers. Some were documentary filmmakers. So there's actually quite a bit of diversity in what we think of as a typical ethnographer. And there's quite I think a good number of female ethnographers. It is heavily male biased for sure. But it's not that there aren't any female ethnographers. And there's a lot of discussion on this. So since basically the 70s and 80s, feminist anthropology really began to critique the process of anthropology up to that point. So what can we do about this empirically? We try to account for what I call meta-ethnographic bias as best as we can. So we can code ethnographer gender to know if there's a female co-author, for example, as a part of the authorship of the document. We can also look at year publication, because the focus of ethnographers changes over time. They might be influenced by theoretical perspectives, other historical forces. We can account for just the length of the document, so more pages in the document, more opportunity for evidence. We can also control for the total number of pages of ethnography per culture. That's a sort of indication of researcher effort, for example. Like I said, there are different author types. The eHraf gives us some designation if it's an ethnographer, a missionary, an explorer. And there's also an assessment of document quality, if it's excellent primary information, if it's good secondary information, and so forth. And then we also have the duration of fieldwork. So we can use all these measures to see if any of these type of meta-ethnographic features are predicting the data that we create, basically. And so when I do this work, I try and see what of these types of features are driving any results. And to sort of sum this up, sometimes you see some effects, sometimes you don't. In the leadership data I've worked on, we didn't see an effect of female ethnographers finding evidence. Is there a question? Okay. We didn't see evidence of female ethnographers finding evidence of female leadership. In a punishment data set, we did find evidence that a woman co-author was a predictor of evidence for material punishments, but not others. We didn't find any evidence of these features predicting variation in our reputation data, but my colleagues Emily Post and Shane McFarland did. So it kind of depends. And we haven't done this bias assessment yet for these data, but it is a part of the project. So I'm going to use these OCM codes as well. And like I mentioned before, they're hierarchically nested. So what I'm going to do is at the paragraph level, I'm going to add up all of the OCM codes within a particular category, and that will be the value for that OCM category for that paragraph. Now there's one problem here, and actually I've talked to HRAF about this. There's no single OCM code for leadership, despite it being a pretty fundamental process for human sociality. But there are about 3 codes that collectively get at leadership. And so what I've done is created this OCM code group for leadership, which is the codes of status, role, and prestige, community heads, and social control. So I'm showing you the 2 groups from which those codes come from. These other codes I've struck through aren't included in the data. And so I'm taking these 3 codes and going to sum them together to make a leadership code group. And then the 620 community group is going to include the community structure code. And then also I've labeled each of these code groups as either opaque / symbolic or instrumental culture, just as a sort of marker to see how they might associate with other aspects of the data. So the first thing I'm going to show you is using these OCM codes as predictors of evidence for teaching at the paragraph level. So the paragraph level, it can include either 0 or up to 7 instances of social learning that can be classified as teaching or not. And we have 52 unique subject code predictors. So I used a penalized elastic net regression model just to sort of apply some shrinkage and identify the OCM codes most associated with evidence for teaching. And we have 2 different sets of coefficients here. The one on the left are basically within 1 standard error of the optimal shrinkage parameters. They're more conservative. And what we can see is that there's a few, and all the other coefficients that are at 0 are not plotted here. So what we can see is there are a few of these OCM code groups that are positive predictors of evidence for teaching. So values above 0 indicate a positive association with evidence for teaching, and negative values indicate a negative association with evidence for teaching. And in the blue, this is the opaque culture or symbolic culture, and the red are the instrumental culture type subject codes. And so the strongest positive predictors of evidence for teaching include leadership, history and culture change, kinship, ideas about nature and people, family, religious practices is also up there, religious beliefs. So this kind of tells us that these paragraphs that are giving evidence for individuals' teaching are discussing these sort of complex, opaque social phenomena. The negative predictors include things like processing of basic materials, leather, textiles, and fabric, food processing, the food quest. So this is manufacture and subsistence, a lot of the instrumental cultural features of hunter-gatherer lifestyles. Next, we're going to use the other coded variables we have. So in addition to coding the process of social learning, we also coded the domain in which the social learning was occurring, the gender of the learner, and the age of the learner based on this categorical typology, and then the mode, whether it's oblique, vertical, horizontal, and in some cases we didn't know. And this is a multi-level logistic regression model. So we have the outcome as whether it's teaching or non-teaching. This is at the instance level. And we have random effects for paragraph and documents. And we're using pretty conservative normalizing priors. And here's our results. And the contrast analysis here are basically what you can see visually. So cultural values and religious content is more associated with teaching than manufacturing and subsistence. There is no effect of gender, so there's nothing going on there. Learners who are in middle childhood and who are adolescent are more likely to be involved in these processes of teaching than are individuals in infancy and early childhood. So there's a bias of teaching towards middle childhood and adolescence. And the modes were more linked to oblique and vertical, and less so with horizontal. So it's the parents and it's the older individuals who are doing the teaching. It's not so much horizontal, children teaching themselves, basically. So a lot of this makes sense, it's intuitive, but it really emphasizes that teaching is more closely linked to, there's more of a bias in teaching towards cultural values and kinship and religious content than manufacturing or subsistence. And so our conceptual model is effectively this. We think there's variation in neural capital, so knowledge and intelligence and this sort of the cultural content of this opaque and symbolic cultural information. There's variation in individuals who are respected and in high status. This leads to social influence and leadership opportunities. It also leads to the ability, the capacity to teach and spread this important information. And then individuals who are both leaders and they have social influence and are knowledgeable. So then they can spread these, the information associated with these cooperative norms can do so. And then this will lead to basically the emergence, spread, and maintenance of cooperative norms. Now, there's a lot more to the story, of course. Punishment's going to play a role. Other socio-structural features are going to play a role. But this is our sort of conceptual thinking. So kind of to summarize what we see from this systematic sample of ethnographic texts, we see that teaching is more common for symbolic and socially complex phenomena. These are like cultural values, social history, learning kinship structures, which can be very complex. And it seems that teaching becomes more common across development, up to adolescence in particular. It's more often occurring between older individuals and younger individuals. So it's not necessarily just within nuclear families or between individuals of the same age grade. And we see some evidence that teaching is associated with leadership. So individuals who have influence are using that influence not just to organize collective action or to punish or to accomplish all these other functions that leaders do, but they're also using that position of influence to actively teach and actively teach the information associated with symbolic, opaque cultural values. And so what these results also suggest is that teaching is probably a key, what we call computational service and a function of leaders. This computational service jargon is coming from some other work of mine, looking at the sort of services that leaders are offering to followers to sort of jointly improve outcomes. And so we see this sort of being a computational service to support the norms and institutions underlying cooperation and to spread those norms and institutions preferentially. And now, an important point here is that the knowledge need not be rare. So in some cases, some discussions of prestige-biased learning, it kind of suggests that the knowledge is rare or difficult to access, and that's why you need to identify individuals who really best exemplify it, who will be best able to spread it, to teach it. But in our view, it just needs to be heterogeneous. And so there needs to be some mix of informed versus naive individuals, and that there needs to be then some mix among individuals who have influence versus those who do not. And these two dynamics will sort of incentivize informed leaders to teach the norms that are going to best benefit themselves and their social partners. And so you can think of your sort of favorite evolutionary mechanism at play here, kin selection, strong reciprocity, pseudo-reciprocity, etc. And so we're suggesting that perhaps selection for cultural transmission of these pro-social norms is driven by leaders who are capable of teaching, executing that process. Now, so this is an interesting idea, maybe, but it's an idea we sort of developed conceptually from these patterns in the ethnographic data. And it's an evolutionary idea, but we can't test this evolutionary idea in the sort of cross sections of ethnographic reports we have. And so Jorge's idea, which is very much still just a work in progress, and at this point, just a series of emails and conversations, is to sort of see if we can test the evolutionary dynamics of this idea. One thing we've been talking about was a two population replicator dynamic model, where you have a leader population where individuals are influential and knowledgeable, and you have a follower population of individuals who are influenceable and naive. And then so leaders can either teach the cooperative norm at a cost to themselves, or they can not be teachers. Not all leaders are teachers in the real world. So that would be an example of being a cooperative defector. Followers then can be pupils of the cooperative norm, so they can learn these cooperative norms potentially at a cost, or they could be lazy and not learn these cooperative norms. And then so the goal of the model would be to see if these parameters allow to support some evolutionary stable pattern where the process of teaching by leaders can drive the evolution of cooperation. So we're still thinking about this, and this is still, very much an ongoing conversation, but that's where we are now. So I want to thank Shana and Jorge for their discussions and helping me work on this. And thank you all for the opportunity to share the ideas with you. I'm happy to take any questions, comments, critiques that you might have.